right, guys, so today we're going to talk specifically about Cites. So you've seen reference to Cites a few times. We want to talk about what's going on with respect to elephants and ivory, how Cites has been involved in that. But then we're also going to talk about the reemergence of ivory trade and why it's happening. So let's start by reminding ourselves who Cites is. And so you're a little bit familiar with this already. So somewhere in your notes you probably already have that Cites stands for the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And then I said technically it's of wild fauna and flora. So Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of wild fauna and flora. And what this really is an international agreement between governments. It's an international agreement between governments. So a bunch of different countries have come together to form this agreement. Again, the goal, you already know this, the goal of Cites is to ensure that international trade in animals and plants, so it's not just animals, even though we're talking about animals more than anything else, to ensure that international trade in animals and plants does not threaten their survival. So they're acknowledging that trade takes place, and they want to make sure that trade doesn't interfere with the sustainability of these species. Now, participation is voluntary. You don't have to join, but there's a whole lot of members, 183 members when I last looked it up. That was February of 2018, so this could have changed just a little bit. But members who, again, have voluntarily associated themselves with Cites are called parties. So when you see me refer to parties, that's talking about these member nations. So participation is voluntary, but if you join, you're called a party. And most importantly, whatever Cites agrees to is legally binding. Whatever Cites agrees to is legally binding. So if you're going to be a member, you have to go with whatever votes take place. And so it's voluntary, but binding. So that's important to understand. Now, Cites has been around for a really long time. It actually was drafted as the result of a resolution that was adopted in 1963. So if you trace the origins of Cites, it really dates back to 1963. We don't really care exactly what this resolution, all this was at the time, but 1963, the problem was that it took a little while to actually work out the details. So trying to create something like Cites, which is going to be global in participation, have lots of international participation, and be legally binding, well, it's going to take a little while to draft that and figure out how exactly that's going to work. So it's not surprising that Cites didn't really enter into force until 1975. So it took 12 years, folks, to kind of work out the details and get everyone at the table, ready to volunteer to participate, but agree that the outcomes are going to be legally binding. So 1975 is really what we want to think about as the beginning of Cites. One thing that we have to acknowledge here, guys, is that when we talk about trade in species, wild animals and plants, crosses borders. Just like air pollution crosses borders. So when we think about trade in species, we have to realize this is not just a one country thing, that these are usually things that are traded between countries. They're crossing borders. So for that reason, just like if we want to clean up air quality, it's going to require international cooperation. One country alone is not going to be able to solve the problem, although certainly we want to see countries get involved in domestic regulations. But one country alone, countries acting by themselves, may not be enough. So just like air pollution, the problem is a global one. And so we need to think about it globally. So Cites was really conceived in the spirit of such cooperation, appreciating that if we're going to have any approach to sustainability, everyone's got to be at the table. That it has to be a global agreement. It can't just be regulations within countries. So currently, in the spirit of this cooperation, Cites gives protection to more than 35,000 species. So its reach is quite far, 35,000 species. And guys, again, you don't need to get every single word down, just get the things that are really relevant here. But do make sure you understand that when we talk about species, while we're going to be talking about elephants, we need to remember that there are also plants that are protected under Cites. So both plants and animals. So 35,000 species, but those species include plants and animals. One thing that we're going to note, and one takeaway from today, is that the level of protection might differ. The level of protection might differ, and it might differ geographically. So it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all, as I'm going to illustrate to you in the case of the African elephant. So how is this entity funded? Seems like this is an operation that would require some significant funds. Well, if we look at the core administrative costs, because there's going to have to be personnel, there's clearly a web presence, there's officers, those are financed by the Cites Trust Fund. So there's this trust fund that money flows into, and that's going to cover those core administrative costs. So the people that work for Cites, their cost of maintaining a web presence, for example. There might be some administrative costs, data collection costs, those kinds of things. Now the money in this trust fund comes from contributions. And they call them contributions because, again, participation is voluntary. So if you're voluntarily joining, you're making a contribution. And those contributions are coming from those member countries, those parties. And there is a scale. Not everyone pays the same, right? And that makes sense. It wouldn't make sense if we're going to have a global agreement that goes across continents for everyone to pay the same. So I'm sure that that scale must be related to GDP, that if you're a poorer country, you're going to be paying less. That makes sense. The size of your economy is going to matter. But we also want to acknowledge that there's external money that flows in as well. There are private entities that also care about the work that Cites is doing. And so donations are accepted and received from private organizations. And I found a few. I know most of you have heard of the Pew Charitable Trust. The Pew Charitable Trust is in the United States. They donate money to Cites. We've got the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So you've probably maybe not heard the name, but you've seen that abbreviation, NOAA. You've got Foundation Franz Weber International. And these are just to name a few. So between the member nations, the parties making their contributions, and nonprofit organizations, charitable organizations donating money, this is how Cites funds itself. So let's talk about listing a species. Let's talk about this idea of listing a species. So as we've said, different species might have different levels of protection. So we have to look at the species individually. Each species might have different levels of protection. But we're also going to show that the same species might have different levels of protection. The same species could have different levels of protection in different parts of the world. And this is all based on the appendix system. The appendix system. So when we think about the lists, when we think about listing to the list, what we're listing to is to the appendices. And there are different appendices. Now, for ivory trade, the most relevant appendices are Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. So we're going to be talking about Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. Those are the ones that are relevant when we talk about protecting ivory, protecting elephants and limiting ivory trade. So Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. Now, Appendix 1 is the strictest level of protection. Appendix 1 is the strictest level of protection. So the animals on Appendix 1 are afforded the most protection. They receive the most protection. So these species are the most endangered among CITES listed animals and plants. So anything on Appendix 1 are the things that are considered the most endangered. So the most endangered animals and the most endangered plants are going to appear on Appendix 1. So it's the highest level of protection. Specifically, things on Appendix 1 are species that are threatened with extinction. Threatened with extinction. They're threatened with extinction. So if you have a species on Appendix 1, it's threatened with extinction. So as such, CITES prohibits international trade in these species. So if you're on Appendix 1, if you have a species on Appendix 1, you can't trade. There is no trade allowed. So basically, Appendix 1 results in a ban on trade. Because a ban on trade, theoretically, is going to give them the most protection. And I said, of course, theoretically, because we understand some of the nuances that we've talked about last class period. Now, we're talking about commercial trade. So make sure you understand we're really focusing on banning commercial trade. But there are exceptions. So trade is banned except when the purpose of the import is not commercial. So commercial trade would be selling jewelry, selling statues, selling art that's made out of ivory, right? That would be an example of commercial trade. Maybe there are musical instruments that you make that use ivory, depending on how much. So there are exceptions when we're not talking about commercial trade. For example, scientific research. Maybe a plant needs to be imported for the purpose of scientific research, right? Can you imagine if we just simply banned trade in plants, but yet we have cancer researchers that need to get their hands on specimens? So we don't want to prohibit the good kinds of things we're doing, looking for cures for cancers by importing plants, but that's a non-commercial use. Now, when something comes to fruition, there might be a whole nother situation about commercial use, but if you're just experimenting, researching, it's not commercial use. But if you need to use a species for that kind of reason, if you're seeking an exception, there's a permit process. And so this process is pretty well monitored. Remember, we've talked about that policies are only as successful as the monitoring. This is well monitored. So you want to do scientific research with a plant, you're going to have to complete a permit. That permit goes through an approval process through CITES. All right, so we understand Appendix 1. We're banning trade for commercial purposes. Now, Appendix 2 is a little different. Appendix 2 lists those species that are not necessarily now threatened. So that's kind of more subtle language, but they're not necessarily now threatened with extinction. So extinction's not imminent right away. So we're not worried about immediate extinction, but these species may become extinct if trade is not closely controlled. So these aren't in immediate danger of becoming extinct, but they could become extinct if trade is not closely controlled. So you understand the distinction between Appendix 1. Extinction is threatened right now. It's now threatened with extinction. Appendix 2, it could become extinct. It could be moving in that direction if we're not careful, right? See the difference between Appendix 1 and Appendix 2? Does that make sense to everyone? So in the case of Appendix 2, international trade may be authorized. International trade could take place, but there's a permit process. You would have to apply to be allowed to trade. But the rules of the game are less strict than Appendix 1. So guys, with respect to ivory, whether you're on Appendix 1 or Appendix 2 matters, right? Everyone agree? Because if you're on Appendix 1, what's the case? No trade, right? Ban. Appendix 2, the situation's different, right? Your country might be able to trade, but you have to seek permission, and permission can be granted. It depends on your circumstance. Yeah?
For the permit process, is it permission to export and import, or just one?
So mainly I think they're looking at permission to export, because permission to import implies that somebody has gotten permission to export, right?
Okay.
So my guess is that it's really more a permission to export. Because the other two, if you're importing, somebody had to export. They'd have to have permission for that. All right. Now, here's the thing. We've got these very different rules between Appendix 1 and Appendix 2, but a species can be added to Appendix 1 or Appendix 2. So a brand new species needs to be added. It could go automatically onto Appendix 1. It could go automatically onto Appendix 2 immediately. But the other thing is that a species can move between the appendices, right? So if you have a species, if your elephants are Appendix 1, might that give you an incentive to try to get to Appendix 2? Because Appendix 2 gives you a little more flexibility, right? So you can kind of see where we're going with this, right? Your listing, are you Appendix 1 or Appendix 2 with respect to your elephants, determines what you can do with trade, and it changes your incentive structure. And certainly if you can get to Appendix 2 from Appendix 1, that would be a good thing if your goal is to trade in ivory. So again, how does this work? It's all approved by the parties, right? Everyone gets a vote. Votes are binding. So for a species to be listed, Appendix 1, Appendix 2, or moved from Appendix 1 to Appendix 2 or vice versa, it's by vote of the parties. And I think in our last lecture we talked about that I looked it up and it was 2/3 vote. It wasn't simple majority.
Okay, this might be a silly question, but like, what's the incentive to stay in Cites? Because like.
So what's the incentive to stay in Cites? Well, so that's a great question. What's your incentive to stay in Cites? Remember, this is international trade, not domestic trade. And we're going to make that point again in a moment. So if my country's not at the table, Cites is making decisions that affect my country, but I'm not at the table to participate in any discussion. Because whatever they decide, if every other country is there, and they ban trade in this species. While it doesn't affect domestic trade, it affects my ability to participate in an international trade. So don't I want to be at the table when that discussion takes place? Because it's going to affect me whether I'm a member of Cites or not, right? So that's something that would suggest it's better to be at the table and at least try to influence things and have some role in setting of policies rather than have those policies affecting you, because international trade means you can't participate. All right, so it turns out, guys, that the African elephants are listed on both Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. Same species, but some are listed in Appendix 1 and some are listed in Appendix 2, and it depends on geography. It depends on geography. So you can have different locations having a different listing, Appendix 1 or Appendix 2. So when we talk about appendix listings, it depends on what country we're talking about. It depends on what country we're talking about. It turns out that Botswana and Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe are all Appendix 2. So those 4 countries are Appendix 2. So Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe are Appendix 2. So what's the implication of this, folks? What's the implication of being Appendix 2, Ben? Okay, they can potentially export. Do they get just to export willy-nilly, whatever they want to do? No, it's by permit, by permission, but there are opportunities to trade. Okay, so these 4 countries have a little bit of flexibility that they can petition for trade. We're going to be talking about some situations where that has happened. So, for these countries, Cites sees it differently. For these 4 countries, Cites has agreed that the elephants in these countries are not necessarily now threatened. That kind of awkward language is Cites language. That these elephants in these 4 countries are not necessarily now threatened with extinction. So extinction's not, imminent. It's not threatened right away. It's not about to happen. But as we've said, they may become so unless international trade is strictly regulated. So species must be doing okay in these areas, but if we let ivory trade go uncontrolled, unchecked, unregulated, unmonitored, then probably we're going to have decimated the population. But for these 4 countries, the possibilities of trade exist because under Appendix 2, you can trade by permit with permission of Cites. So again, you don't need to get every word down. What's the goal here? This is Cites language. I'm just putting it up here to show it to you, is that they're doing this in order to avoid utilization incompatible with their survival. We already understand that, so we don't necessarily need to get that down. But I wanted to show you the Cites language, and that's why it's in quotes. All right, so Appendix 2 for 4 countries. But African elephants from other African nations appear on Appendix 1. So if you're not in those 4 countries, if you're an elephant anywhere else in Africa, you're listed on Appendix 1. And Appendix 1, remind me? No trade. Good. No trade at all. Not even by permit. You cannot permit and ask for trade if you're an Appendix 1 listing. Now, what could you ask for? You could ask to be moved, right, from Appendix 1 to Appendix 2, which then might open up some possibilities. But again, they're going to evaluate your situation, and that's by vote of the member parties. All right. Now, elephants in Asia are also on Appendix 1. We're not going to spend much time talking about the Asian elephant because we're really interested in talking about ivory trade. Asian elephants need protection too, not just for ivory. Their tusks are smaller. They don't all have tusks, but they are killed. People want them for medicine, other things. So they also domesticate them, so they're captured, traded. But again, we're focusing on the African elephant. So again, Appendix 1, we get this. We don't need to keep writing this down, but I'm just going to keep reminding you. Appendix 1 suggests that in every other location in Africa, other than those 4 countries, we think that the elephants are threatened with extinction. And so we're just going to ban trade. So as we said, importation for primarily commercial purposes is not allowed. We already understand that. We've already said that. Again, same language, so as to not endanger further their survival. Okay, we understand Appendix 1 versus Appendix 2, right? That makes sense. We understand that some African nations are on Appendix 2. The others are on Appendix 1. That means 4 countries can theoretically trade in ivory. Nobody else can, right? Nobody else can. All right, so quick recap just to make sure we understand. Appendix 2, we agree is less strict. Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, they're not yet threatened with extinction. There's some flexibility for trade. Appendix 1, more strict, the most strict. All other African nations except for these 4 are Appendix 1. We think that these animals are threatened with extinction. Probably elephant management's not going that well. Population growth is not going that well. And importation for commercial purposes is not allowed. All right, we get this. We have hit this too many times, right? All right, so let's move on. Now, interestingly, guys, there are some other exceptions that we need to talk about, some other exceptions. So there are other things that we need to understand about this ban that comes from Appendix 1. The first thing that we need to really emphasize and understand that when we talk about these trade restrictions, they are applied only to international trade. International trade, right? What we've been talking about is banning international trade. But is all trade in endangered species and wild fauna and flora, is it all international? No, clearly you have domestic. So understand that these CITES rules are governing the import, the export, and I learned a new term, I had never heard this before, re-export. Has anyone heard the term re-export? I had to look it up because I did not even know what they were talking about. I've never seen that. But re-export would be you import it and then you resell it to somebody else. And I was thinking, well, why in the world would countries be involved in re-exporting? But it's actually kind of strategic. So re-exporting might be, let's say that Jake's country wants to get some species and they want to get it from Kelsey's country, but they can't sell directly to each other. Maybe there's trade barriers in place. Maybe there's rules in place. So maybe it's sold to me first. I import it from one of the countries and then sell it to the other. Therefore, if they can't trade with each other, I'm that intermediary. And apparently this is kind of a way to bypass trade barriers and those kinds of restrictions. So that's the idea of re-export. It was interesting to me. I'd never really thought about that idea. So, as we just said, CITES rules governs the import, export, and then this re-exportation situation when we're talking about a species on the CITES list. It doesn't address domestic markets. Domestic markets are governed nationally and locally. So domestic markets are not governed by these CITES rules. Domestic situations with trade are basically in-house. The country makes their decisions. So Kenya makes their decisions about domestic trade. and Thailand makes their decisions about domestic trade. And same thing in the United States. We've got the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, and we've also got the African Elephant Conservation Act. So we are regulating our own rules about trade in certain things. But CITES is only when it crosses borders. Does that make sense to everybody? So that means there's a whole lot of potential trade that CITES doesn't govern and might not be able to help get under control, right? Because it's trade within a country. So it might be elephants in Thailand then being used to create products that are sold in Thailand, for example. Okay? So that's the first thing. Domestic trade is not addressed. All right, second thing that we need to note is that hunting trophies have generally been exempt from this. Hunting trophies have generally been exempt. Hunting trophies are generally exempt. Now, you don't just get to do whatever you want. You have to have proper CITES documentation. So again, we're monitoring this. So there's got to be some documentation. But because of this exemption, if you have trophy ivory, so you go hunting in a big game safari type situation, you kill an elephant, you get trophy ivory, and whatever other hunting trophies you have, they can be exported. They can be exported. But there's an annual quota just to make sure that we're not exporting too much. And that's a good thing. But again, as we talked about, quotas are only successful if they're monitored. CITES does a good job monitoring. But let's think for a second, what would happen if we reverse this? What if we said, you know what, let's vote, you're not allowed to export hunting trophies. So let's say we reverse this. CITES votes, the vote passes, 2/3 vote, it passes. So think about the campfire program we've been talking about. Would that hurt campfire? So campfire, as we talked about, it is making a lot of money from people who want to hunt, and the villagers have an incentive to help make sure it's sustainable. They've got organizations that are partnering with them to make sure that they're not hunting too much. But are people going to pay big fees if they can't take their trophies home? Probably not. So it probably makes sense. We understand if this was reversed, it would really hurt the campfire program, which has been very successful for elephant management. So if you're thinking, gosh, why would we let people take their trophies home? We have to think about the bigger picture, and we have to think about all of these elephant management programs that are tied to sustainably hunting and raising a lot of revenue associated with big game hunting, and using that money for elephant conservation and the incentives it sets. All right, we understand that. All right, third, and this is another very important thing that we need to know. This ban on ivory trade applies to ivory acquired after elephants were listed. So this only applies to ivory that was acquired after elephants were listed on the CITES appendix. So guys, is it possible that countries could have ivory that predated CITES listing? Sure. Could there be warehouses of ivory? Do you think that would be easy to monitor, though? It would be pretty challenging to monitor this. Now remember, the Asian elephants listed in 1975, the African elephants listed in 1976. So you're talking about ivory that would have to date back to having been harvested before 1976. But it's possible, right? It's possible. Again, you have to have proper CITES documentation. But if you have ivory that predated the listing, you can import it, export it, re-export it. So you would have to have a permit. And of course, you might have to have an import permit. You probably do. But that doesn't work unless somebody has an export permit, right? So, Brooke, you were asking that question. My guess is you have to have both, but it doesn't make sense to issue only an import permit. So probably these kind of go hand in hand. We're issuing export permits, and we're giving permission for these countries to buy them. Hence, they go together. Does that make sense? That probably is a better way of explaining it. Except for it's possible that country laws might prohibit it. So there might be countries that have laws, their own laws, that prohibit ivory trade. And then that would keep them from being able to export. But if there are no country laws, and there is stockpiled ivory pre-1976 in Africa, it would be legal to export, to sell. Number 4, there are exemptions that can be granted, as we've already talked about, for non-commercial uses. So we've already mentioned this, but non-commercial uses, there are some exemptions. So some exemptions for non-commercial uses. So we've already talked about this. Scientific research, there could be some educational uses. Maybe you're putting something in a museum. But again, you have to have CITES permission. There's a permitting process. Documentation has to be obtained. And you have to prove specifically it's not for commercial use. So you're not selling it as if you were selling something in a shop. All right. So we understand Appendix 1 versus Appendix 2. And we understand the exemptions, the things that would allow trade even with the Appendix 1 ban. So we've just gone through 4 of those exemptions. So let's talk about what we call the one-off sales. And I think you might have learned a little bit about the one-off sales in some of the stuff that you did for homework. But the one-off sales tie to those Appendix 2 nations. Remember, those Appendix 2 nations have been given some flexibility. And that flexibility is that they can have occasional approval for trade. They can occasionally get permission to trade. Occasionally. So Appendix 1, no trade at all, no deal. But Appendix 2, for these 4 countries we've talked about, occasionally they can get approval to trade. In 1999 and again in 2008, countries were given permission to sell. So there have been 2 years where these countries on Appendix 2 have been given permission to sell. So these are important years that we need to know, 1999 and 2008. And so these are called the one-off sales. Why one-off sales? Because you don't get to continuously participate in trade. It's kind of a one-shot thing. One-time deal in 1999, then we're going to do another one-shot thing in 2008. So it's going to be kind of one deal. So in 1999, CITES approval was given to 3 countries. Who's missing? South Africa. So at the time, South Africa was not approved for trade. So 1999, CITES approvals given to Botswana, Namibia, and Zimbabwe. But sale is restricted only to government stockpiles. So government stockpiles, what might be a source of government stockpiles, guys? Natural deaths, what might be another one? So before any ivory before 1975, except remember that was an exemption that had to be permitted. What's another one?
Illegal trade busts?
Illegal trade busts? You know, that's a good question. If they confiscate illegal ivory, can they sell it? Do we know? Did anything we read answer that question? I don't think they can. I don't think that they can seize illegally obtained ivory, like in a bust, and then turn around and sell it. But that's a good question. I'm not sure what they can do with it.
If we compare it to like drugs, like the American government confiscates.
Yeah, like when we confiscate drugs, like we don't sell them, but there's no legal venue, so that parallel doesn't quite hold up, right? Because there's not a legal venue for selling the drugs, but basically we like destroy them. So that's a good question. We probably need to go in search of that answer. What happens to that ivory? But there was one other important source of legally obtained ivory. What was it?
Culling.
Culling, guys. Remember culling, right? So why might a country have stockpiled ivory? Natural deaths, culling, and stuff that they had before the ban, right? All right. The way this is going to work in 1999 is it's an auction process. So it's going to the highest bidder. So it's an auction process. And it's kind of a secret thing. It's behind closed doors. But many conditions had to be met. So this wasn't a, let's just bring this to market, let's just have a big auction. It was really on the down low and very heavily monitored. So many conditions had to be met. What were those conditions? Well, first, only legally obtained ivory. So it can't be from confiscating it from poachers, but I don't know the answer to that. What can you do with that ivory? And maybe the answer is nothing. And interestingly, it could be only sold to Japan. So anybody that was there bidding had to be from Japan. So only sale to Japan. So that's kind of a weird situation, right? It's going to be kind of on the DL, behind closed doors, and the only buyers that were allowed at the table were from Japan. Now, we'll talk about why in a minute, because I see some of your eyebrows raising. Well, why? Why only Japan? We'll get back to that. There was a strict limit on quantity. You couldn't just bring whatever you wanted. So there was a quantity limit set. And all of the money had to be invested in elephant conservation. And that's an important point, because that's kind of one of the selling points about allowing this sale. Okay, you're doing a pretty good job monitoring, but elephant management is expensive. You're sitting on this valuable resource. We're going to let you sell it in order to raise money to do even better with elephant management. Okay, that's great. So all money had to be reinvested in elephant conservation. Now, Cites is on hand. They verify that it's of legal origin. Again, that can be kind of hard, but they're going to make sure that there's no laundering of ivory, because can you theoretically launder ivory? Yeah. So you bring it in from a Appendix 1 country, right? Think about it. You bring it in from an Appendix 1 country, you kind of put it in your warehouses with your Appendix 2 ivory in an Appendix 2 country, right? And then you sell it, and then you share the profits, right? So there could be laundering of ivory, where ivory is brought in from countries on Appendix 1, and it's sold. So this kind of stuff all has to be monitored. So we have to verify the legal origin. We have to make sure that the origin of that ivory is indeed one of these 3 countries. The weight, and they do this at import and export, so that nothing happens kind of in between during transit, etc. So shipments are inspected, right? Because things could be added to shipments. after the fact, after the trade. Okay, under the table, we're going to agree to, I'm going to give you about 20% more. You're going to pay me this much money. So we got to make sure that there's nothing sleazy going on here. So Cites is there. They are monitoring. And again, that's an important part of the process. Permits are checked. All this stuff is going on to make sure all of this ivory is of legal origin. It's legally obtained. It's legit. It's going where it says it's going. Now, the total revenue, guys, from this one-off sale is about $5 million. A lot of money in these poor African nations, right? A lot of money. So hopefully that's going to do a lot of good for elephant conservation. About $5 million. Now, in 2008, Cites approves another one-off sale. So they wait 9 years, right? 9 years between them. So when we said that Appendix 2 gives you some flexibility, it does. But it doesn't mean you get to trade every year. These are really kind of isolated events, these one-off sales. 1999, then 2008. So 2008, Cites approves this second one-off sale. Same countries as before, same 3 countries, but this time South Africa. So now we've got those 4 countries that are now Appendix 2 countries for the elephant. So same 3 countries plus we've got South Africa. This time, however, the situation's a little different because ivory can be sold to both China and Japan. Only 2 countries can buy. So auction style, behind closed doors, but 2 countries can have representatives trying to obtain ivory. The total here was $15.5 million. So again, this is quite a sum. The money has to go back into elephant conservation. And interestingly, guys, the United States supported this. We're a big influence in Cites, and we supported these one-off sales. And my guess is that the logic is that you have the flexibility, you're sitting on stockpiled ivory, it's worth a lot, we can confirm that it's of legal origin, etc. We're going to restrict the circumstances of the sale. So let's do this and allow them to sell a really valuable asset. Because remember, the United States helped push for the ban. And so maybe this seems like kind of the fair way to do things and allow some money to flow into these countries. So I have found a video. Let's take a quick look. Turn up the volume.
The rare material of one of the most...
Start again.
Ivory. It's one of the world's most precious commodities, and elephants, whose tusks long have provided most of the rare material, are one of the most protected species on the planet. The sale of ivory has been banned since 1989, but now 4 African countries are being allowed to sell ivory that was collected and stored as the elephants died over many years. Tonight we have the story of these controversial sales from our newest reporting partner, Global Post, a web-based news organization providing international coverage. Jeff Barbie joins us now from Johannesburg. He recently spent time in South Africa's famous Kruger National Wildlife Park, where he had a rare look inside the warehouse where 51 tons of ivory are about to go in the auction block. I asked him why, even though this sale is legal, animal rights activists are opposed to it.
Well, there's really two issues at stake here. One is there a possibility of corruption? And also, when you legitimize the dealing in ivory after a ban of such a length, there's a fear that other people who are involved in the illicit trading of ivory, which incidentally is becoming worse, could actually turn around and sell their ivory off here and there and say that it was from this legal sale.
And the view of these international conservation groups seems to differ greatly from the view of the locals there, who say that they can and should benefit from this sale. So tell us more about what the locals are saying.
Well, the local people, they would like to see a give back from the park, and I don't think that they have seen much of it. There's about 1 in 5 South Africans live very close to Kruger National Park. It's an extremely densely populated area of the country, and as such, there is a great deal of community building, school building, hospital infrastructures that need to be put in place there. And although we did discuss this issue with the park authorities, it seems at this point they're not willing to say that that's where the money from this ivory sale will be going.
I mean, there is the South African government that says that these measures are needed to really cut back the herds of elephants, and because they've been protected, there are too many of them now, they're doing damage to the park.
Since 1969, we've learned a lot more about the capabilities of areas like Kruger to sustain wildlife. The South African government is essentially not going to cull the elephants, but they do have that option available.
We've been talking to Jeff Barbie from South Africa about what is going to be the first legal sale of ivory in quite some time. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Martin.
All right, so highly controversial. We'll talk a little bit more about why. So you heard a little bit of explanation in that video that there's opposition to the sale. What were some of the things that we heard about why conservation groups might be opposed to this?
Corruption.
Okay, we heard about corruption. You know, what if they're laundering ivory? What if they're labeling ivory that was illegally obtained and trying to sell it? We don't really have 100% foolproof way of being able to monitor this. Okay, good. What else? What else did we hear? We've had a ban in place, but now we're going to allow this trade. Ben?
A rise in the illegal trade beforehand.
Say again?
A rise in the illegal trade beforehand.
Okay, it could lead to a rise in legal trade. Is that what you're saying?
Illegal.
Illegal?
Illegal.
Illegal. So a rise in illegal trade. Exactly. Did you hear him talk about legitimizing trade? So we've sent this clear signal that trade is not allowed, it's banned, but now we're sending kind of an opposite signal, right? So there's a great deal of opposition. We'll summarize that again in a second. But one of the additional concerns on top of it that weren't talked about here in this video is participation of China. Participation of China. And one reason that people are really concerned about the presence of China at this sale is that they've been a big offender in the past. So if we look at this data right here, China's all the way on the right. This is Asian countries with the most ivory seized between 1989 and 2011. And we're seeing that there has been a whole lot of illegal ivory seized in China. So people are concerned. We know that China has been a big player in ivory trade, and this is of concern. So we have to ask the question, why China? And it kind of explains also why Japan. So some of these arguments also apply to Japan in 1999. So why China? Well, first, China already has a demand for ivory. Same thing with Japan. These are countries that already use ivory. They use it symbolically. It's part of their culture, part of their tradition. And so since both China and Japan already use ivory, there's already a demand for ivory, they're not creating a new demand. They're not creating a new market. So imagine if we were selling to just some random country, let's say Switzerland. Do we want to create new demand in Switzerland and create a new market in Switzerland? We don't. So why not stick to those existing markets? And so Japan and China, that was one of the reasons for Japan in that first trade in 1999. But there's another potential explanation, is that some people think that China was being rewarded for stepping up their conservation, that we've seen some changes in China, and so given those changes in China, maybe this is kind of a reward, a carrot. So rewarding China for stepping up their own conservation efforts. And I found this interesting statistic that said, according to the Elephant Trade Information System, the world's largest database of elephant ivory seizures compiled by traffic, China is now involved in around 63% of seizures, whereas in 2002 the figure was 6%. So before, we know there was a whole lot of illegal trade going on, but they weren't doing much about it. Only 6% of seizures were in China. But now, 63% of seizures are in China. So that's really important to understand, because a lot of illegal ivory finds its way in China. China did nothing about it before, and now they're stepping up their game. So this is interesting. Reward China for kind of getting on board with trying to keep illegal trade under control, since China is a key destination for illegally obtained and illegally traded ivory. Some think that linking legal ivory with China's huge demand will reduce poaching and illegal trade. So give them a legal supply to match their demand, link up legal supply with their demand, and that could have good outcomes, reduce poaching and reduced illegal trade. Okay, it's an interesting idea, right? If they have legal supply, then they don't need as much illegal supply. That makes sense. So hopefully this legal supply kind of offsets or displaces some of the illegal trade. All right, interesting idea. But conservation groups don't agree. They don't agree that this is going to be the outcome. So this is an interesting experiment. It's an interesting experiment. One that some people said wasn't going to work. But that's why China, that's why Japan also. Don't create any new markets. So if we look at this graphic right here, we're starting to see some spikes. This is estimated weight of ivory and number of seizure cases. So we are looking at illegal trade. If you look at the red lines, those vertical red lines are the two one-off sales, 1999, 2008. Now, for those of you who have studied this idea of correlation versus causality, which I know some of you have, we can't necessarily infer a causality from this, right? This would not be very scientific for us to claim, just on the basis of this graphic, that one has caused the other. But certainly we can observe from this data that after the 2008 one-off sale, what do we see? We see increased illegal activity, right? After the 2008 one-off sale, we see more illegal activity. So, Gracia, what might we be able to conclude from that? What might be the speculation? Nick?
Well, the one-off sales influenced a broader demand within those markets.
Okay, the one-off sales potentially led to greater demand, for increased demand. Trafficking, poaching became a bigger thing. What might be another way of thinking about it? Remember that phrase, legitimizing trade? That the one-off sales kind of legitimized trade, made people start thinking about trade, stimulated trading activities. Again, it's unclear from this graphic. Certainly there's people that look at this, But we certainly want to ask the question, what is going on here? Something is happening. We need to get to the bottom of this, right? So something is going on here. So after 2008, as we just said, the data shows a spike in illegal trading activities, right? Data shows a spike in illegal trade after 2008. So this is unfortunate. Correlation, causal, we're not sure. And poaching is on the rise. So this is problematic. Poaching is going up. So researchers start suggesting that this one-off trade in 2008 has kind of revived the ivory market. That this new activity sent this signal that has led to revival of the ivory market. That is not a good thing. We don't want to revive the ivory market, and maybe this one-off trade in 2008 did just that. We also have to remember that even though Cites is doing their best to monitor, do we agree that it's hard to monitor if the stockpiles are from legal sources, right? Do you agree that that would be really hard to monitor? I mean, they're going to monitor it the best they can, but how do we know that they're not seizing ivory and putting it in their warehouse from poachers? How do we know they're not laundering ivory from over borders, from Appendix 1 countries? We don't know. We don't know if we have corruption in governments that might be allowing more poaching to go on as a source of revenue. But either way, people say this has sent the wrong signal, that the one-off sale in 2008 simply sends the wrong signal that we are okay with ivory trade. So we're legitimizing ivory trade. That's what a lot of researchers think is what's going on here, to keep it very, very simple. So after 2008, we do start seeing some sophisticated methods of testing, right? There's some videos on this. There are some very interesting breakthroughs on testing. For example, using DNA, where DNA can be used to map the origin of the elephants. Well, that's kind of cool. So if we want definitive answers, we can test using DNA, map the origin of the elephants to make sure it's actually originating from the countries that they say it's originating from, that it's not coming from other countries in a kind of a laundering scheme. But we agree that there's just too much ivory to do this for all tusks that are part of these one-off sales, right? But there are some cool sophistications, and I wanted to remind you that that exists. But we're not going to be able to apply that kind of methodology to every single tusk if we're talking about $15.5 million worth of ivory. That's going to be a problem. Interestingly, though, we are starting to see some changing attitudes, and this might be what saves the elephant. So we saw these one-off sales in 99 and 2008. You don't need to write that again. But the interesting thing is there was support at the time. It's not clear that there is support now. That where we're sitting right now, if Cites talked about another one-off sale, it's not clear that there would be the kind of support there was before. Remember, the United States supported the sale in 1999 and in 2008. Let's let these countries sell a valuable resource. Let them get the money they need for social progress, for elephant conservation. But it's not clear that the United States would support it now. All signs suggest that the United States wouldn't support another one-off trade. So the U.S., very vocal in the situation with respect to the African elephant, has changed its mind about how it views these one-off sales in light of the problems that started growing after 2008. So as we said, and you don't need to get this in your notes, but we talked about poaching dramatically increasing. We talked about stimulating demand That was a good answer that came from one of you guys. So we're seeing some change in attitudes. Now, one country that's been in the spotlight is Tanzania. Tanzania. So one country that's been in the spotlight is Tanzania. And you see Tanzania there on the map. So they're a little bit further away from those 4 that are Appendix 2 species. But Tanzania, obviously, African nation, it's a relatively poor African nation. And so to give you an idea of where it sits, in 2016, its GDP per capita was a little over 3,400, and that's purchasing power parity. So remember, numbers always look higher when we look at purchasing power parity, that way of measuring GDP, because it looks at the costs of living in those countries. So 3,402. Now, they requested permission to delist elephants from Appendix 1 to Appendix 2. So they asked permission to go from Appendix 1 to Appendix 2. So remember, that requires 2/3 of a vote from CITES parties. But it would give them a little flexibility. They would be able to trade in ivory. So we understand why they'd want to do it, right? Everyone agree? If I were to ask you a question on a test, why would they want to move to Appendix 2? Because they could sell their stockpiled ivory and participate in future one-off sales like the countries that had already participated. So we understand why they might want to do this. But CITES turned them down. So it went up for a vote. Again, it's got to kind of be based on scientific research, but also it's going to be related to kind of people's attitudes who are sitting at the table who cast their vote. CITES turned them down. It did not pass. It did not pass. So Tanzania thinks this is unfair and that they should be compensated for this ivory. They're sitting on this warehouse of ivory. They cannot sell it. It's worth probably, some millions of dollars, and they want to be able to recoup the money for something that they have. And at this point, they're turned down. CITES says no. But then there's an interesting turn of events. There's an interesting turn of events. So let's watch.
Growing up here in Virginia, family came first. Our faith kept us centered.
Next year in Bangkok, Thailand, Kenya has submitted a proposal for a total ban on ivory trade, while Tanzania was pushing for a new trading window to allow it to sell its ivory stockpile to fund conservation measures. Patrick Amimo reports on the ivory trade about turn that has been welcomed by wildlife conservationists everywhere.
At the 16th meeting of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora to be held in Bangkok, Thailand, Tanzania was keen to push a proposal seeking to transfer its population of elephants from Appendix 1 to Appendix 2. Under CITES, species threatened with extinction are listed on Appendix 1 and international trade is banned. Appendix 2 contains species not immediately threatened with extinction but which may become so unless trade is subjected to strict regulation. Tanzania was pushing for the ban of trade in ivory to allow it to fund conservation measures, while Kenya had submitted a proposal for a total ban on ivory trade. Tanzania has 19,000 kilograms of stockpiled ivory. Kenya and Tanzania share the elephant ecosystems on their common border in Masai Mara and Amboseli National Parks. Kenya had expressed fears that allowing Tanzania to trade in ivory would increase poaching. Other African countries that supported total ban in ivory, citing an upsurge of poaching, include Congo, Ghana, Liberia, Mali, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone. The African elephant is split listed, with all populations listed on Appendix 1, except those of Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, which are listed to Appendix 2 after they were allowed to trade in ivory in 2008. A country seeking transfer of elephants from Appendix 1 to Appendix 2 must provide CITES Secretariat with scientific evidence regarding the numbers and trends of the populations, the conservation and management of those populations, and threats to their status, adequacy of controls on trade in ivory and its products, and the effectiveness of current anti-poaching measures. Tanzania's decision to withdraw its proposal ahead of the meeting is sweet news to Kenya and Rwanda, who share borders with Tanzania and rally support for a total ban in all ivory trade. According to Wildlife Crime Scorecard report, 2011 was the highest year on record for elephant poaching, where ivory weighing more than 23 metric tons was confiscated. A pound of ivory now fetches 18,000 shillings. Patrick Amimo, KTN Prime.
This invention is 50 times stronger than rare.
All right, so a turn of events. What did we see? We've got two countries that share a border, right? Who were they? Kenya and Tanzania share a border. Kenya wants what? Total ban. Tanzania wants what? They want to change to Appendix 2 so that they can trade. But then what do? It was a little hard to hear because it's a really thick accent, right? They withdrew their proposal. So Kenya wants a complete ban, but Tanzania withdraws their proposal. So they kind of give in to maybe the pressure. They stay on Appendix 1. Interestingly, in Kenya, remember Kenya wants the complete ban. We see some interesting things going on. Let's take a look.
Absolutely. The burning is not going to stop anything, but it is sending a message, and we hope that people will see that message and they won't buy ivory. They'll be disgusted by it.
So guys, I remember this making news, right? Pretty amazing. Kenya's got this huge stockpile, probably millions of dollars of ivory. Burn the whole thing. Again, do people think that that's going to stop trade? No, but it's a symbolic gesture at a huge opportunity cost, though, right? Now, they're Appendix 1, so they can't trade it, but, you never know in the future if they might have been able to. So I remember when that happened, that was in the news. Huge symbolic gesture. All right, so now we're in year 2016, and so Cites has some decisions to make. They're discussing trying to find a way to have a decision-making mechanism, some kind of set of rules for decision-making, because they want to be able to look at countries individually. We're starting to have a situation where countries look very different in some parts of Africa. So they're looking for some kind of decision-making process so that they can treat countries individually, because we're starting to see really a lot of heterogeneity in the success of elephant management. Of course, some countries are hoping to revive ivory trade, right? The big four, most importantly, the ones that were involved in the 2008 one-off sale. But the ban was set to expire in 2017, and so that kind of necessitated this discussion in 2016. Can we lift the ban? Can we create a set of rules that makes it a little bit more individually tailored? The ban has actually continued. But the idea is that they had to make a decision about how to proceed, and they did proceed by continuing the ban. And that came up for vote at this Cites 2016 meeting. And so the ban does continue. And we're going to skip that for right now. But one thing we need to acknowledge is that this ban creates some inequities. And again, it's not a panacea, it's not a perfect solution, but this ban creates some inequities because there's really no agreement about the ivory ban within Africa itself. Southern Africa wants trade. So look at the map, guys. Who's in Southern Africa? We've got South Africa, we've got Namibia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe. What do those have in common? They're all Appendix 2 nations, which were given permission to trade in these one-off sales. But the tide is turning against them, right? Because people are maybe not liking the idea of the one-off trades because of the problems that 2008 one-off trade might have caused. So Southern Africa feels like they've got some success stories with elephant management. They want to have trade. They feel they look different from other areas. And again, these are poor countries, right? They want money to address social issues, schools, medical care, but also pay for elephant conservation, which is not cheap. So that makes total sense from their perspective. But most recently, we're seeing some countries get active within country. Remember, Cites is international trade. Domestic trade is determined by the individual countries. So we're starting to see domestic trade rules that are set by these individual countries. So Kenya, we've already learned a little bit about Kenya. Ban on ivory trade, domestic ivory trade. So CITES covers international. Kenya's own laws govern domestic trade. We already saw a video about the symbolic burning of the ivory stockpiles. But this attitude's not necessarily reflected by all African nations. So we want to keep that in mind. The United States has also moved in this same direction because we see a near total ban on trade in the United States. So again, our own laws covering our own domestic trade. But there's some exceptions. For example, and I'm just giving you a couple examples, but for the most part, trade is banned. But let's say you have a musical instrument and ivory is on that musical instrument and is worth less than 50% of its value. And it was manufactured or crafted prior to this ban. You would be able to sell that. Does that make sense? So there are some exceptions, but the United States has followed suit. Ivory cannot be traded domestically, and so U.S. governs its own domestic trade rules. So give me just a minute to finish up here. Most importantly, we're seeing some interesting changes in China, and so you're going to be doing some reading on what's going on in China, and I suggest that you make sure you really master that content. So time will tell if this is enough to really protect the elephant. But between the continuation of the global ban and action at the individual country level, maybe we will see some success stories. All right, so we're going to stop there, guys. Please make sure you read your announcements and follow through with your homework.